Hello, welcome to another episode of Varsity360. I'm Columbian sports editor Micah Rice, joined today by Tim Martinez, and we have a lot to talk about in high school sports on the reclassification front, but thankfully we got this winter weather behind us. It kind of shut us down last week, so we are back coming to you from the First Pacific Financial Studio. Again, thanks to First Pacific Financial for their support of the show and of high school athletics and of the community. But Tim, we've got some reclassification news to talk about. And so that was something that if you pay attention to how high school leagues, high school tournaments, how they're sort of organized, this was a pretty big deal. And so let's just kind of start with the basics. Obviously, when you have high school sports, you have some schools that are bigger than others. You wouldn't want, say, a school like Camas with 1,200 kids playing against a school like Kingsway Christian, which has a couple hundred. That wouldn't be a level playing field. So the WIAA sets them into different classifications so that different size schools end up playing against similar schools. So why don't we just start with the basics? How does the WIAA set those guidelines for what schools play in what classifications?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because in some of the social media comments and things that I've seen, there were a lot of comments about, different schools are massaging the numbers to keep themselves at a certain classification. And really there isn't a whole lot of leeway for schools on their enrollment numbers. So basically, what the WIAA does is they take an 8-month average of the enrollment figures that the schools have to send to the state. Now, these are numbers that they send to the state to let the state know how many kids are attending, actively attending their schools. So it's enrollment plus attendance, and it's an 8-month average. It's and they only take the numbers for grades 9, 10, and 11. So a lot of people sit there and go, hey, this school has like 1,300 kids, but their number was 820. Well, part of that is they're only counting 3 grade levels. The other part of that is that number, that attendance number, is going to be lower than what enrollment's going to be because it's about attendance and if the kids are actually coming to school. And these are numbers that the schools send to the state office of public instruction so that they can get funded from the state. So they're not going to want to short their numbers.
Right.
They're getting, that's why the WIA takes that number because they know it'll be a solid number. So, and then there are other things that will massage that number down. There's some, the WIA replaced the free reduced lunch metric that was used previously because some districts are no longer, they just offer free lunch for everyone. It's part of their product. So they use a metric called direct certification. It's sort of a socioeconomic metric that determines eligibility for free reduced lunch. And so that way they use that. And so that will pull the numbers down. If schools have a higher number of that direct certification, they can have their enrollment number reduced. And so then they sort them out by classification. So previously in 4A, the number that kept you in 4A was 1,300 or higher. Mm-hmm. And then 900 to 1,300 was 3A. And then it was like, I think 450 to 899 was 2A. And then it was like 225 to 450 for 1A, and then 2B and 1B on down. This last year, they lowered the threshold between 4A and 3A. They're trying to balance out the numbers of schools between 4A and 3A. 4A, the last time classification, had around 50, I believe it was 51 schools or 52 schools, and 3A was up almost close to 80. And so they wanted to try to balance that out, in part to create a little bit more balance between the classifications, but also the 20-team state tournaments that are necessary because of the number of schools in 3A have been very unpopular among 3A schools. This round of 20 is often, whether it's the state basketball tournament or softball or volleyball, they're like play-in games to the double elimination bracket part of it. And so some teams feel like they don't really get the full state experience. They play one game and they're out if they lose instead of having the double elimination situation. It also causes for scheduling headaches. You have to squeeze in another round of games in a tight window. So they're not really popular. So they were trying to work so that they can try to get 3A down to a number where they can use a 16-team bracket and the 4A as well, and they didn't quite get there. So first they dropped that number from 1,300 down to 1,225 last summer, and then this fall they dropped it down to 1,200, and even then they didn't quite get there. And so we had some schools here locally that we didn't know because they were kind of on the bubble. Prairie was the second largest 3A school after that threshold got dropped to 1,200, and Mountain View was fifth. And so we didn't know if the WIAA was going to move that threshold down a little bit more to create that balance. Ultimately, they decided not to. Mick Hoffman, I reached out to him on Monday. He said that the executive board thought that moving it down another notch would move teams up to 4A, and then those schools wouldn't have had an opportunity to appeal down, because they do offer the opportunity for schools to say, hey, can we play a level down? Here's our reasoning why. And those schools would not have had that opportunity. And then there also would have been adverse impacts potentially on those schools and the leagues that those schools play in at that late juncture. So they decided to keep 3A at 73 schools, which means they still have a 20-team state bracket going forward. Mick Hoffman said that's what he anticipates doing it going forward, and you know, when they do another classification process, they hope maybe they can find a better number that'll even that out. But so basically, in the 4A and 3A locally, nothing changes. You still have 4 teams in the 4A Greater St. Helens League, 5 teams in the 3A Greater St. Helens League. The 2A Greater St. Helens League, which was 9 schools, is now going to be 8 because Fort appealed down to go to 1A. They won that appeal.
And we'll talk in depth about Fort. I want to get into that in the unique situation. But just for people that are maybe new to following high school athletics, or they're paying attention now for the first time because they have a kid or a grandkid or a nephew or a cousin that's playing, how often do they go through this reclassification?
It's a 4-year process.
Okay.
You know, it used to be a 2-year. They used to do it every 2 years because, you know, they wanted to make sure that the numbers were as updated as possible. But then the whole process, going through this whole process every 2 years, was a big hassle and a lot of uncertainty that was involved in that. So they spread it out and they now make it a 4-year. So these classifications that will go into effect next fall will be good through the 2027-28 school year. Mm-hmm. So for the next 4 years. And the appeal process happens, I think, every 2 years. So you can if you appeal down, you have to reappeal to stay down, or you could ask to appeal down further. So they give you an opportunity to make some changes there. So once these classifications are set, which they are now leagues can figure out what their leagues are going to look like. They can start making schedules for next school year, next sports year, and moving forward.
Yeah, I think we were bracing ourselves for the potential of quite a bit upheaval if a school like Mountain View had gone up to 4A, or if a school like Prairie had gone up to 4A, because the way we've been dealing, like you mentioned, we've had a 4-team 4A Greater St. Helens League and a 5-team 3A Greater St. Helens League. Suddenly, it would have been really awkward, I think, if both of those schools had gone up to 4A for 2 reasons. Number one being that you'd have basically a gutted 3A Greater St. Helens League consisting of maybe Heritage, a Kelso team that probably wouldn't want to be in that league with just a couple of teams, and having a couple of 2A rivals right across the river there. But also, I got to think there's a lot of just structural and size-wise differences between a Skyview, a Camas, and a Union, and a Prairie or a Mountain View. That would have been, I think, a kind of an odd pairing to have all of those in 4A.
Yeah, so I mean, when we started talking about this with a lot of athletic directors like last spring, that was the concern. They thought for sure that Mountain View, because Mountain View was on the cusp last time they did this. And then they said, and Prairie might. And then as we got the initial release of numbers back in the summer, it kind of was like, it looks like maybe Prairie's the team that's going to go to 4A, and Mountain View might be still 3A, but they weren't quite sure. Ultimately, if one team had gone, it would have made a big difference, at least in the league. We have a 4-team league and a 5-team league, and then otherwise it would have been a 5 and a 4. But yeah, the competitive balance, particularly in certain sports, would have been very impactful for the folks at Prairie. So I think it worked out well. There's another thing too with enrollment and splitting classifications and the impact that has on competitiveness. I see this again through social media, people making comments about, different size schools and we'll talk more about Fort later, but that was sort of the big one. It's like, hey, Fort's got like, their Fort's hard number is like over 1,000.
Right.
But then they get reduced back from the social economic thing that drops them down into the 2A bracket, and then they appeal down to 1A. So they actually have an enrollment. Their WIAA enrollment is twice as big as almost the largest 2A school. And so people are like, that or 1A school, and they're like, that doesn't make sense. But really, I think enrollment is a metric that maybe like when you and I were in high school had more of an effect about how competitive teams were. Yeah. Now it's less of an impact and more the social economic factors are playing a bigger role. Also, geography plays a bigger role. Like if you're located near a larger metropolitan area like Tacoma or Seattle, your access to playing, club sports and high-level club sports and is easier, more accessible than if you are in like, maybe Yakima or the Tri-Cities, or even down here, in Southwest Washington, where we do have Portland available. So a lot of people compete and get training out of Portland and the Vancouver area. So those tend to be bigger factors than enrollment. Enrollment is still a factor, but I think it's been diminished in recent years.
Yeah, we've done obviously plenty of reporting over the years about how schools that draw from a more affluent area, those are the kids that are going to, personal trainers, that are joining the best travel teams, that are playing all year round, versus maybe some of the, less affluent areas where it's you're not playing sports all year round because maybe you've got siblings to take care of, or you're working part time to help the family make rent. And so yeah, that's definitely been a trend that we've seen. The 2A, I think there's been some question about how, obviously that's one of the more vibrant and larger leagues in the area. Was there ever any question about any of those schools which tend to draw from very fast growing areas of the county? I think of Ridgefield, I think of Atkinson. Was there any discussion about some of them possibly moving up or being on the cusp?
Yeah, I think early in the process, again, maybe about a year ago or last spring, there was thoughts about Ridgefield, because Ridgefield is a growing community. Their numbers, every classification cycle has been getting larger and larger. It used to be, if you went back maybe 10, 12 years, the 2A Greater St. Helens League, all the schools had enrollment in either the midpoint of the 2A or towards the bottom. They were actually, pretty much all of them were smaller in the 2A range. Now we've got some schools that are moving up to the upper range. Ridgefield is right at the top right now. River is just somewhat behind them. I think Bay's in there. Washougal's been growing. So it's a mixed classification. Then you have Woodland down at the lower end. They're in the 400s for enrollment. Atkinson still is kind of mid-sizey, maybe towards the lower end range of the classification. So I think originally the question was Ridgefield, because how much is Ridgefield going to grow? I think when the initial we got the preliminary enrollment numbers back in the summer, we saw them over the summer. We thought, okay, it looks like Ridgefield's going to be safe. And the other thought was, the question was Woodland. Is Woodland going to maybe slip back down to 1A? But they never. That also wasn't. Again, once we got the first preliminary numbers, like no, they're comfortably in.
And so they're set for 4 years now.
Yes.
It could obviously be a much different picture 4 years from now, but that is way down the road. So those 2A rivalries, which I think you'd agree would be, some of those 2A leagues, whether it be in football or basketball, they're some of the more entertaining ones, because of the size of the league. Right. So that we've got a healthy 8-team league there. But going down even a little smaller, and before we get to Fort Vancouver, the Trico League is now an 8-team league.
Yeah, I mean, this is a league that for, actually, when we started the most recent classification, they were a 5-team league. It was Castle Rock, La Center, Kingsway, Seton Catholic, and Columbia White Salmon. And during the last 4 years, Stevenson has been kind of coming back. The first couple of years back down, they moved down to, they've always been, or they have been over the recent classification process, a 2B size school, and they have always opted up to play in the Trico, mostly to keep them, close to the white salmon, which is one of their gorge rivals there, and just to remain historically in the Trico. This previous reclassification, they thought, no, we're going to play where our numbers suit us. We're going to play into the Central 2B League, which in many sports is a very, very competitive league, and the travel situation for them was just tough. And their closest opponent in that 2B League is Kalama. And then after that, you got to go past Kelso and Longview to find,
You're talking what, Toledo, Adna. Yeah. So you're traveling more miles to play, in a lot of cases, tougher opponents because, how often has that league had a state football champion recently? Right. Quite often. So, it makes sense for Stevenson to play in the Trico. So
Stevenson had made they kind of were a sort of the last year or two, sort of a half in, half out kind of. But they've been working their way back to Trico, so we knew that they were going to opt up and join them. That makes 6. And then Kalama's numbers grew to the point where they are back being a 1A school. I think they were last a 1A school in 2015, I think, in the last classification back there. So Kalama had a lot of success with football. They won some state championships, several state championships in 2B in that time. They're going to be back in 1A. And then Fort Vancouver moving down fully into, because in football they have been down in the Trico for the last 4-year classification cycle. So they've been playing football in the Trico, and now they're going to play all of their sports down. I think in girls soccer this past year they were a 1A independent, so they weren't eligible for postseason, but they were playing a Trico League schedule for girls soccer. Now basketball, baseball, softball, boys soccer, all those sports will be playing down at the 1A level. So it gives them the 8 teams, gives them a nice even number, a good number. And so when they go and make schedules, for football, most teams they're going to play, of their 9 regular season football games, they're going to play 2 non-leagues in week 1, week 2, and then they're going to be in league play from week 3 to week 9, which is the same with the 2A Greater St. Helens League will be doing, and has been doing. So they'll have, a lot of their schedules set up, and the other, like in baseball, for instance, the Trico with these 5 teams that they've had, they would play everybody 3 times, so they get like 12 league games. Well, now they'll probably just play everybody twice because they've got 7 other opponents, so that's 14 league games, and so that'll make their scheduling a lot easier. And in basketball as well, it'll be 14 league games. So it's and I think in football it's going to be. I think this next football season for the Trico is going to be really interesting.
Oh yeah,
you've got Stephen Catholic, a returning state semifinalist. You've got La Center; they were loaded with juniors last year, and now you throw in Kalama in there, which is they won a state championship a couple of years ago, and they're kind of rebuilding from that state championship team, and they are again getting stronger, getting better. So,
and I think Kalama, the last year they were in the Trico, they had an epic game against La Center to decide that league title that Kalama ended up winning. So I think for competitive balance, that's going to be a great thing for those programs. But let's talk about Fort, and I think it's a great move. It's a move that benefits the kids. I think it benefits the league. I think we all kind of. We're scratching our heads why we kept seeing Fort being paired against these other schools that are in a completely different situation when it comes to, how they fill teams, how they, get athletes, on those rosters. Fort Vancouver, the numbers, the raw numbers, they're basically a 3A or a 4A school, but it's a different situation at Fort, and we've done plenty of reporting as to the socioeconomic reasons why. But I like this because I think it speaks more to what high school sports should be about, which is about having a great experience for everybody and seeing what sports can do to lift up people in their lives. And I think having Fort's athletes in a situation where they're more competitively balanced and in contests and in leagues where they feel like they have a shot, I think that's going to be not only great for the kids on those teams, but probably help the coaches to convince kids that, hey, if you come out, you get to play a sport you like, you're going to have the room to get better at it and not be dejected because you're playing against a 2A team that's beating you by 40 points in basketball.
Right. Yeah. Moving down in classification doesn't guarantee automatic success.
Right.
But what it usually does allow is more competitiveness. Mm-hmm. I kind of think back to Heritage and Evergreen used to be 4A schools, and they've kind of moved down. They moved down to the 3A, and in all sports, they are competitive in just playing competitive games in league and being competitive and making runs for playoffs and making state playoff appearances. I think that's what the opportunity is for Fort. They get to go down into 1A and they get to compete against teams that are playing at their level. Mm-hmm. And so it gets them a chance to kind of go in and it's a whole lot, you could still have a losing season, but if you're losing games, like in basketball by 8 points, 7 points, 6 points, it's a whole different vibe than losing them, 20 points, 30 points, when you feel like you were never in the game to start with. So, and again, I think, as they kind of build their programs around that, it's easier to build when you're having some success than struggling. So,
well, I think we got a preview of that, and I think it was a great test case with the football program. Football program was kind of on the leading edge of that move to have Fort opt down to 1A. And I think for football, which made a lot of sense because no sport is a numbers game quite like football, you saw Fort going from a situation where they weren't even competitive in their football games to winning a handful of games. And even though maybe this last season they had only a handful of wins, they were in some of those games. And you have a coach there in Doug Bilodeau who's now he's been there a couple of years. You had athletes like Caleb Svitkovich who stuck with the program and was able to. I just remember when they finally beat Stevenson to break to grab that first win in years, just how much that meant to those kids and that coaching staff. And so I thought that was a great test case that showed why the move makes sense, not just in football, but now in volleyball and now in soccer and in any of those, baseball and softball. I think you're going to see, like you said, more competitive contests and allowing sports to really play a productive role versus no one likes. And even if you're on the winning side of a blowout, you don't get anything from that. But this should make it for a very rewarding experience. I think that's why I think it's the right move.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I like a system in which teams, when schools get a chance to appeal to the WIAA and say, hey, where we're at right now is not working for us. Here's the reason why. Here's our evidence, and they can kind of go down and say, and I think we would be better off down at 1A. And so this process, that it's kind of a new process, that's something that the schools didn't have. I think it's a positive thing. It's a good thing, and it's about making the experience better for the kids. And I think that's the big thing here.
Now, I took a look at the spreadsheet with all the numbers for each school statewide, and there's no school that is playing below its raw numbers. Fort is unique in this case, right? There's no school that should be a 3A that's going to play at 1A. But my question is, do you think you're going to see this happen more, maybe with some schools up in the Seattle area that traditionally have been not competitive for socioeconomic reasons? Do you think we're going to see more of this happen?
Yeah, probably. I think, every case is different. Like, for instance, if you're up in the Seattle area, the option to go to 1A might not be an option for you because there just aren't a lot of 1A leagues up in the Seattle area. And so, and even moving into 1A might not really help you competitively because the 1A schools that are in Seattle area are often private schools.
Right, and very successful.
Yeah. The soccer teams from around here know that very well. They go up and play those District 2 1A Kings. Soccer teams like Kings and University Prep and Seattle Academy and those schools, very good in some sports and many sports. And so, but I think the opportunity is there for teams and schools to find a situation that'll help them have a positive experience for their kids.
Well, and most valuably, I think it shows a precedent that the WIAA is willing to take into account those situations faced by the schools. And that's where I think, not only does the Fort Vancouver administration, whether it's athletic director James Ensley or other people in the Trappers athletic program that have advocated for the school to make that move. I think a lot of credit goes to the WIAA too for being flexible in this situation. I think there's way too many instances where we kind of look at a situation in high school athletics and say, is this really best for the kids? But I think this is proof that the powers that be and the administrators in charge, whether it's at the school level, the district level, or the state level, have said, how can we do right by the kids at that school?
Right. The metrics of it, when you look at that document, you see Fort at I think it's 844 or something like that. And they're playing with schools in the upper edge of that 1A class. It's 450, I mean, it's they're twice as big as almost most of the 1A schools in enrollment. But, I think the history and the situation that Fort is in is unique, and I think I applaud the WIA for creating an avenue for them to be more competitive.
Well, yeah, because I mean numbers can break it down pretty simply, but we all know that there's nuance to situations like that. So I'm a big fan of this, and I'm a big fan of a robust Trico League with 8 teams, a robust 2A GSHL, and also basically the status quo in the 3A and the 4A Greater St. Helens leagues. We've seen a lot of competitive play across all sports there, and so that's going to be sort of locked in for the next 4 years. It should be fun.
Yeah, and now the next thing that we can start doing is start looking at like other leagues in for instance District 4. So the 2A Greater St. Helens League has 8 teams. I think the 2A Evergreen Conference got reduced to 5 in this process. I haven't looked at that, but I saw Tumwater Football put out a tweet saying, hey, we're looking for non-league games from week 1 and 4 and then potentially another one later in the season. So I kind of just looked at that schedule and I went, oh, they must only be playing in 5-team league because they got 4 league games.
Well, then if they keep that 4-team crossover district bracket, that means the entire league, perhaps, especially if you keep that pigtail play in, that would mean all 5 teams would have a shot.
So right now, we're heading into district basketball for that. So right now, that's the way the setup is that the 2A GSHL has 9 schools because Fort is still in basketball in the 2A. And then up the Evergreen, I think, is 6 teams up there. And so, 4 2A GSHL teams get a berth into districts, 3 from up north get in, and then the 4th place team from Evergreen plays the 5th place team from the 2A GSHL in that pigtail game to get that 8th team in. Now, with 8 teams down here and 5 teams up there, the proportions kind of balance out where you just kind of go 5 and 3, and you don't have a pigtail game. So I don't know.
We shall see.
So that's all got to be negotiated, but from a proportion percentage, it's 61.5% to 62.5%. It's pretty close. So there's that, and then I haven't even looked at the 1A Evergreen Conference to figure out how many they have. But so other things will factor in, and then there's also state allocations, like how many teams are in the district and how many state allocations they're going to get from that level. And then the 4A and 3A, they've got to sort of figure out their by-district agreement with District 3 and how many berths do they get for those things and how that's all going to work. These are things that ADs will be working on in the months ahead. So the whole kind of landscape kind of changes here with a new class. And so it'll be interesting to see how things sort of shake out. Well,
we'll be we'll have our ears to the ground, and we'll be ready to report any of those twists and turns that determine how the postseason contests are structured or how the leagues develop. This was a big news development that we were waiting for. It's finally here. We have some certainty going forward, and we'll look forward to, now that we got this administrative stuff out of the way, back to the games. And we have a bunch of those coming up with the race to the winter postseason. We'll see you next week on Varsity 360. Have a good day, everyone.